Now that we've talked through the process of the sliding filament theory of contraction, let's take a look at some of the ways that the nervous system and the skeletal muscle system interact with each other. There's some more anatomy for us to learn here. We've talked about how a single neuron has a process that leads away from it called an axon, and at the end of that axon, there's actually branching that occurs. We talked about how there are what we refer to as terminal branches that emerge from each one of these individual branches, and that these terminal branches have these widened areas at the end that we sometimes call knobs or synaptic knobs. And we've looked at images, drawings, of how these terminal branches come in and impact the sarcolemma of an individual muscle fiber. This is the image that I'm remembering. This is a representation of an individual muscle fiber, a muscle cell, surrounded by this yellow membrane that we call the sarcolemma. Remember when we described the neuromuscular junction, this specialized synapse between an incoming neuron and this muscle fiber, we looked at the axon coming down from this neuron. This is actually one of the branches of the axon at the end. And then that branch itself branches out when it impacts the membrane of the muscle fiber. These are referred to as terminal branches, and they widen at the end into these swellings that we refer to as knobs. So, an individual neuron sends out an axon. At the end of the axon, there is branching that occurs, and each one of those branches will communicate with a single muscle fiber. Each one of those branches, as it communicates with that muscle fiber, will itself branch out into terminal branches that make up the neuromuscular junction. It's important to know that each muscle fiber, each individual cell, is innervated by one neuron, one motor neuron, one effector neuron. But each motor neuron can supply multiple muscle fibers because of all that branching. So we use a term to describe each individual motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it communicates with. We call that combination a motor unit. Take a look at the drawing on the bottom part of this slide, right over here. This represents a skeletal muscle over here, and in that muscle there are many fascicles, as we've discussed. If you pull one of the fascicles out, you're looking at several individual cells, several individual muscle fibers here. And what they've drawn in for us is the innervation. So this is the axon coming off of a neuron. You can see this happens to be a myelinated axon. And they've drawn in for us the Schwann cells that are secreting myelin over the surface of that axon. Now, when we get down to the bottom of the axon, we see two series of branching. The axon branches out, that's what they're showing us here. And then at the end of each branch, there's a second branching that goes on. These are the terminal branches. And each of the terminal branches has a little swelling at the end that we can't really see. So each one of these individual muscle fibers, each one of them is being contacted by a set of terminal branches. So each one of these muscle fibers is controlled by or innervated by one motor neuron. It's just that they're all being supplied by the same motor neuron because of this branching pattern. So we refer to this neuron and all of the cells that it innervates as a motor unit. Now, over here on the right side, there's an actual image taken underneath a microscope of a motor unit. You can see the individual muscle fibers. They have been teased apart from each other so we can identify them individually. And then you can see this black linear structure coming in. This is the axon that is coming off of a single neuron, a motor neuron. Now, this axon is branching. And as it branches, it sends a branch to each one of these muscle fibers in the area. And we can't see it at this level of magnification, but where this particular branch, for example, contacts this particular muscle fiber, there are terminal branches down here that we can't see. And those terminal branches are creating that neuromuscular junction. Again, if we go back to this image, here's what we can't see under the microscope. We can't see that this branch from that axon itself will branch out into the terminal branches, creating this very specialized, very complex site of communication between this neuron and this muscle fiber. And we call that point of communication a synapse. And we call this specialized synapse a neuromuscular junction. So each muscle fiber inside of what we think of as a muscle, each individual muscle fiber is innervated by one motor neuron. A single action potential is generated in that neuron. It travels down the membrane of that neuron. It travels into the branch and the terminal branches that impact that one muscle fiber. And it causes a single contraction of that muscle fiber. And because one neuron splits off, branches off, and impacts several muscle fibers, when the action potentials come down that neuron, they're going to hit all of the individual muscle fibers in that motor unit. One single action potential, when it impacts a motor unit, is going to cause a single contraction of those muscle fibers, and that is what we refer to as a twitch. Now, we've mentioned this term twitch before, but we've not really talked about it. Remember, we said one of the ways that we classify muscle fibers is by the nature of the twitch that they produce. We talked about a fast twitch and a slow twitch. We said fast twitches occur in about 7.5 milliseconds, while slow twitches require about 100 milliseconds to occur. So now we have a better understanding of what this twitch is. The single action potential, the single contraction, that's the twitch. So each individual twitch involves a contraction. And remember from our length tension diagram, that's going to involve shortening of sarcomeres until they hit a peak shortening and a peak level of tension or force, and then a relaxation. The thing is, a single twitch doesn't produce anything noticeable in terms of the activity of that muscle. That's not what allows us to do work with our muscle. Instead, we require a series of action potentials to come out of that neuron. We need several action potentials, one after the other, to come down the membrane of the neuron and impact the neuromuscular junction and cause contraction. That creates what we refer to as graded muscle response. The single individual twitch is not going to allow you to pick up your coffee cup or to walk up the stairs. It's a combination of twitches from the arrival of many action potentials. Now, the ultimate strength of the contraction in a skeletal muscle is determined by two things. Number one, the rate of the action potentials coming down through the neuron. So the frequency, that's another way of saying that. And how many motor neurons are involved at any one time. Because each motor neuron is going to hit several individual muscle fibers. So if more motor neurons are involved, you're going to end up with more motor units contracting. Now, when we talk like this, when we discuss motor units and we talk about multiple motor units joining together in graded muscle response, what we're talking about is a coming together of the nervous system and the skeletal muscle in what we refer to as excitation, contraction, coupling. The excitation from the nervous system, the contraction, the mechanical contraction from the skeletal muscle. Those two things are tightly coupled. So take a look at the two graphs on this slide. The graph on the upper left is what we would see during a muscle twitch. So what you're looking at in this graph, or what we call a myogram, myo meaning muscle, it's time passing by across the x-axis and force of contraction on the y-axis. Now, we looked at something similar to this in the length tension curve. But remember, in a length tension curve, it's the length of the sarcomere that's on the x-axis and tension or force on the y-axis. Here we're looking at time passing by on the x-axis. So that's why this is what we call a myogram. It's showing us a twitch. It's showing us a single contraction produced by a single action potential arriving down a motor neuron. So the first thing you can see as we travel through the first few moments of time, and the scale of time here would be milliseconds. This black line right here, the dotted line, this represents the moment that we apply a stimulus, the moment that we apply the action potential. Now you'll notice there's a little length of time right at the beginning that they've labeled the latent period. We've talked about all the things that happen when the action potential arrives at the neuromuscular junction. We've talked about how the neurotransmitter has to be released, the acetylcholine, and it has to bind to receptors on the sarcolemma. And then we have to have sodium channels opening up, and then we have to have that action potential regenerated, and it has to travel down the T tubules, and on and on and on. That takes a couple of moments to occur. So from the time the action potential arrives to the time that the twitch begins, that's a latent period. We're just waiting for everything to happen. We're waiting for the myosin heads to bind to the thin filaments. Then we see the upward motion in the force. We see the force increase, increase, increase. That is the contraction of the twitch. We hit a peak, and then we go into a relaxation. This is what a single twitch looks like from a single action potential causing this singular contraction in a motor unit. It takes a couple of milliseconds and it's done. Now compare that to this, which is a combination of twitches in 3 different muscles. It turns out that while a twitch is a twitch, doesn't matter which muscle you're in. The twitch itself is the same thing. The time of the twitch, the timing of the twitch is going to vary depending on the muscle that you're looking at. And that's because of just the literal physical size differences of muscles, number one, and the distribution of fiber types. Fast twitch, slow twitch, oxidative, glycolytic, all those things that we talked about. It makes sense, in other words, that if you looked at the extraocular muscle, the lateral rectus it's called, it's one of the eye muscles. It helps move your eye. The twitch for that muscle is very fast. We talked about this. Your eye muscles need to be capable of very rapid, but not very sustained movements. Now, if you look at the gastrocnemius muscle, which is, of course, that muscle on the back of your calf, that one needs to produce a little bit more of a sustained contraction. It's gonna last a little longer. The soleus even longer. So, yes, a muscle twitch is defined the same regardless of which muscle it's occurring in, but it's going to look a little bit different depending on where the muscle is in the body and what kind of distribution of fiber types it has. So, we said a minute ago that the strength of contraction in a muscle is ultimately determined by the rate that the action potentials are arriving, the frequency, and the number of motor neurons that are involved. Let's look at the rate of action potentials now in a little bit more detail. If muscle fibers, a group of muscle fibers, receive a new action potential while they're in the middle of a twitch, what happens? Well, it turns out that the second twitch will go ahead and start, but that second twitch is going to be additive to the first twitch, and you're going to get a phenomenon called wave summation. In other words, excitation-contraction coupling is additive. It sums over time. If you ask muscle to contract again and again and again and again by sending more and more action potentials down the axon, the twitches are going to add up. That first twitch, as we said a moment ago, is going to cause contraction to occur. You're going to have acetylcholine released. You're going to have sodium channels open. You're going to have a depolarization. It's going to travel down the T tubules. It's going to release calcium from the terminal cisternae, and so on until you get a contraction. As the second and subsequent action potentials arrive, you're just going to see more of that happening. More acetylcholine, more binding, more depolarization, more action potentials going down the T tubules, more calcium released from the terminal cisternae, and that's going to allow a spreading out of the effect. More sarcomeres become involved. More muscle fibers are experiencing more contraction. So the first twitch arrives and begins, and then as more action potentials come in, there are more twitches initiated, and you have a summation of the force generated, what we call a wave summation. Now, depending on how fast the action potentials are arriving, depending on how fast the frequency or the rate is, as summation goes on, the twitch starts to look a little different in that the relaxation stage gets shorter. Remember, there are really 3 stages, but 2 that are critical. There's the latent period, yes, the time that it just takes to initiate things. And then you have the contraction to maximum force, and then you have relaxation. When the frequency of the action potentials goes up and up and up, as more action potentials are arriving faster and faster, in order to accommodate that, this relaxation period, this relaxation phase is going to get shorter and shorter and shorter. I'll show you what this looks like on the myogram in just a minute, but this is what we refer to as incomplete tetanus. Now, there will come a point where we're at a maximum level, a maximum summation of these twitches. And at that point, the relaxation part of each twitch is just eliminated. There simply isn't enough time for all of those sarcomeres to relax before they're asked to twitch again. So you end up with a sustained contraction. This is what we refer to as tetanus or complete tetanus. Let's take a look at this on the myogram. Remember, all a myogram is it's a graph. It shows us time passing by in comparison to the tension that's generated. So on this graph, what we're looking at here is that individual twitch again. And then we're looking at the phenomenon of wave summation. We're looking at the phenomenon of incomplete tetanus, and then we're looking at complete tetanus. Start with the twitch. Remember, the first thing we do is we apply the stimulus. We apply the action potential, essentially. At the neuromuscular junction, there's a little bit of a latent period because it takes time for everything to get geared up. And then we start to see contraction. We start to see each one of the sarcomeres in the muscle fiber shortening. The force goes up, 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 up till we hit that maximum, because there will come a point where the sarcomeres are completely contracted. They're as short as they can get. And then the sarcomeres will relax. The end of contraction comes and relaxation comes. Let's hit it again. Another action potential. That's what the orange arrow indicates. We're going to stimulate it again. Force goes up, up, up through contraction. We get to the peak. We start to come down on relaxation. But look, we hit it again. Another action potential. The relaxation period doesn't get to finish. Since we're starting here, since we've already generated this much tension, if I go to the y-axis, we're up at this level of tension right here. We haven't had a chance to fully relax down to no tension, but we got to go up again. We just got hit with another action potential. Up, up, up we go in terms of force. Start to relax, we get hit again. Up, up, up we go. So look, what ends up happening through wave summation, because the frequency of the action potentials is so fast, we don't allow the sarcomeres, we don't allow the muscle fiber to completely relax before we ask it to contract again. So we end up with a higher level of tension or force than we would have had if we allowed it to go down to baseline again. This is summation. We're adding the effects of each action potential together with the last. Now, as the rate or the frequency of the action potentials gets faster and faster and faster, we see something else happen. We go into this incomplete tetanus pattern and then into complete tetanus. In complete tetanus, the amount of tension, the amount of force in the muscle just flatlines, it plateaus. You see no relaxation going on. We're at a level of contraction. The muscles are contracted. The muscle fibers in the muscle are contracted, and there's no relaxation at all going on. It's a continuous contraction. It's a tetanus. Now, a good example of tetanus, a good example of what happens when skeletal muscle is forced into contraction that lasts, that doesn't give up, that doesn't end. Think about the images you've seen of a person getting hit with a taser gun. As you know, when a taser is fired and that little dart hits the person's body, the electrical signal that is sent into their skeletal muscle is so fast and so strong, all of their muscles, at least in their large muscle groups around where the probe hits, go into tetanus. They just contract rigidly. And what happens? The person falls to the ground, right? The person falls to the ground and they're essentially immobilized because their muscles are in a continuous contraction. They're in a tetanus. Tetanus is also achieved during certain types of seizures. There are certain poisons that can cause a tetanus to happen, including tetanus toxin, which comes from a bacterium. Tetanus, as you can imagine, is a dangerous thing because the muscles, as they are in this continuous ongoing contraction, are generating a lot of heat from that force. And it's a very dangerous thing. It's not something that you would want to go on for very long. Staying with excitation contraction coupling for one more minute, there's one other state that we recognize, particularly on a myogram, that I want us to be familiar with, and that's a state called Trepa. Here's the word right here. It's a German word, and it translates as staircase. So what Trepa is a phenomenon that we see in skeletal muscle that has not been used for a while. So think about a person maybe who's been in a hospital bed or maybe who's had a leg casted because of a bone fracture. After a long period of dormancy, in other words, skeletal muscle, when it gets stimulated that first time, the twitch strength that it's going to be able to generate is pretty poor. It's about half of what it would normally be. But very, very quickly, those twitches will get stronger and stronger and stronger until they're back to normal. That's what you're seeing in this myogram down here. So remember, x-axis, time going by in milliseconds. Y-axis, the amount of tension that's being generated in the muscle. And everywhere you see a little pink arrow, that's where a stimulus is being applied. That's where an action potential is arriving. So what's happening here is the contraction, the peak, the relaxation, but this peak is maybe about half of what it should be. And that's because this skeletal muscle has been dormant for a while. But notice when the next action potential arrives, the peak goes up a little more. And when the next one arrives, the peak goes up a little more until we finally hit the level, the peak level that we should be at for that particular motor unit. And you'll start to see at that point all the twitches are the right height. This is called Trepa. This is the staircase. That skeletal muscle, it's almost like, I'm trying to think of an analogy. It's almost like when you start up a motor that hasn't been worked in a while, that hasn't turned on in a while. Sometimes it takes a little bit for that motor to get started and start putting out power at a level that it normally does. That's Trepa. So there's a take-home message here about skeletal muscle. Like bone, skeletal muscle needs to be used in order to stay healthy and functional. Just like we saw with bone and the need for bone to be under some mechanical stress, skeletal muscle needs to be stimulated. It needs to have incoming nervous system input in order to stay healthy and in order to stay capable of normal twitches and normal contraction. When it loses that input from the nervous system over long periods of time, it suffers a little bit. Something else to know about this is that skeletal muscle is never fully relaxed in a living body. not even during sleep. You know, we think about our muscles being relaxed when we're sitting on the couch or when we're laying down on the bed, but it's just not the case that your muscles are completely, fully relaxed. And that's because there's always, there's always input from the nervous system, even if it's input at a level that you and I don't recognize as a tight, contracted muscle. Skeletal muscle is always in a state of at least some contraction throughout the body. This provides what we call tone to muscle. So if you're alive, your muscle has some tone in it that's normal. So you can imagine there are disease conditions where the excitation contraction coupling mechanism has gone awry, either because of a problem with the nervous system or because of a problem with the muscular system, or both. There are disease conditions that can cause problems with muscle tone. There's a condition that we refer to as hypotonia. Hypo meaning less. There's also hypertonia. Hyper meaning more. These are two conditions where the amount of muscle tone in the skeletal muscle is abnormal. So people who have hypotonia have a decreased level of tone to their muscle even at rest. And hypertonia is the opposite. Hypertonia is a state where there's too much muscle tone at rest. There's a rigidity to the muscle or a spasticity to the muscle even at rest.